Welcome into another episode of Christ in a Culture War, presented by me, your host, Jesse James Williams. I'm excited to be here. I previewed this podcast on TikTok, and so if you didn't see the TikTok video, I wanted to talk about the Wes Huff, Billy Carson situation and how it has expounded and expanded and how it blew up and how I felt about the whole thing. So I'm going to walk through the events. I'm going to tell you who Wes Huff is. I'm going to tell you who Billy Carson is from my limited knowledge. I'm also going to speak about Joe Rogan, even though I'm not going to tell you who Joe Rogan is, because if you don't know who Joe Rogan is, I don't really know what to tell you. He's got the biggest podcast on the planet. I'm going to discuss the events on how they happened. I want to be clear that I watched the entire debate between Wes and Billy Carson up until the point where Billy Carson left the podcast. So I'm going to get a drink of water real quick. Star Wars mug I got for Christmas. It was a set of 6. That's Darth Vader and the Stormtroopers. So if you think that you can't be a Christian and watch Star Wars, and also don't know what to tell you. So once again, this is an apologetics channel to help us think critically about the Bible, Christianity, and faith, mixed in with some philosophy, I guess, depending on how podcasts go. So behind me, I have a picture of the empty tomb, and over here I have a picture of Jesus knocking at the door. And so, I mean, there's an artist rendition. Anyways, so who is Wes Huff? Wes Huff, to those in the audience who don't know, is a guy from Toronto, Canada, who works for an organization called Apologetics Canada. Wes Huff makes YouTube videos. He has a series with 2 videos called Can We Trust the Bible? And he is an expert in biblical languages, Greek, Hebrew, and I want to say Akkadian, and I always miss one. Coptic, right? He said he's tried to learn Sumerian and he can't quite get it. So Wes Huff made, I think, at least a video or a couple videos disputing this guy, Billy Carson. So who is Billy Carson? Billy Carson is a guy that claims that he is the world's foremost expert scholar on the biblical text. That is coming out of his own mouth. Like, he said that. So he has been on Joe Rogan's podcast, the Flagrant podcast with the comedian Andrew Schultz, and the PBD podcast, which is Patrick Bet-David, who is the founder, I want to believe, of Valuetainment. He is a insurance guy, runs an insurance company, I'm pretty sure, and now has gotten into the political podcast. Patrick Bet-David had Trump on the podcast, and I want to say he might have had J.D. Vance. I'm not sure. Anyways, so that's who Patrick Bet-David is. Billy Carson went on these shows and then on his own platform, and he made the claim that in the quote-unquote Sinai Bible, this Sinai Bible doesn't mention the resurrection, or at times I think he seems to indicate that it denies the resurrection. So there's a guy named Mark, and I apologize, I don't remember Mark's last name. Mark was friends with Billy. They live in the same neighborhood. Their kids play together. Their wives are friends. And then there's a guy named Anton who they say is the social media manager for either Billy or for Mark. And so Mark brought up, because Mark's a Christian, so Mark got into contact with some of Wes's materials. And Mark, being friends with Billy Carson, thought it would be a great idea to have them have a conversation. Initially, it was supposed to be Mark and Billy talking, and I think they were going to go over some of Wes's responses to Billy Carson's claims. So then Mark decides, hey, why don't we just have Billy on the podcast? And this is on Mark's podcast. So initially, they wanted Wes to come from Toronto, Canada to, I want to say they live in Orlando, Florida. I know it's in Florida. I apologize if I'm wrong. That on 24 hours notice, Wes is like, I can't make it, but I will be happy to video call in. So Wes video calls in and introductions are made. And Wes is like, I want to ask a clarifying question. What do you mean by the Sinai Bible? And Billy Carson says, and by the way, you can watch this video on Wes Huff's page. I think you just type in Wes Huff or Wesley Huff on YouTube and you can find it. Also, he has material on the Apologetics Canada website. I think it's apologeticscanada.org. And I think Wesley's website is weshuff.org or wesleyhuff.org. If you type in Wes Huff, you can find his stuff online. So, Billy Carson answers and says, oh, it's one of the earliest complete Bibles that we have, and it doesn't mention the resurrection of Jesus. Wes says, are you talking about Codex Sinaiticus, which is a very early complete copy manuscript of the entire Bible, I'm pretty sure. And Wes reaches behind, he says, because I study ancient languages for a living, which Billy knew in advance, according to both Wes and Mark and Anton. They told him what Wes did. So he pulls up, he's like, I actually have a facsimile, a photocopy that you can get from the British Library, and in it I can show you where it mentions the resurrection of Jesus. So then Billy Carson says, no, I misspoke, and he looks at his phone and he says, oh, I meant to mention the Gospel of Barnabas. And Wes is like, I'm glad you said that, because the problem with the Gospel of Barnabas is we know it's from the 15th century because it quotes Dante's Inferno. And what Wes didn't mention in the podcast, what he mentioned on some later podcasts, was that also it gets a lot of things about Jewish culture wrong, geography wrong. It says that Jesus sailed to Nazareth, but Nazareth is landlocked. It says things like Jesus walked from Mount Sinai to the Jordan River, but those aren't close to each other. Just a lot of mistakes. Go watch the interview for yourself and you can see some. Anyway, so Billy Carson's like, okay, well, if you say so, but I'm going to go with it. Basically, like, every scholar has acknowledged that the Gospel of Barnabas was not written in the 1st century, not in the 2nd century. It is a forgery. Not to be confused with the Epistle of Barnabas, right? So the Gospel of Barnabas. So then Billy says, we're going to go talk into the Old Testament. Let's ask some questions. And then what Wes was trying to ask Billy was, Billy, what is your methodology? And it was very clear that, because Wes Huff is also an historian, right? And Wes Huff is like, what is your methodology? And Billy basically said, I get into a plane, I fly to these places, and I talk to these tribes. And so Billy Carson is an ancient aliens guy. He denies the resurrection of Jesus, which is his prerogative. And he also is big into the Anunnaki. If you're not familiar with the Anunnaki, it's that there's this alien race that birthed the human race. It denies angels and demons. And even in the podcast, Billy's like, I don't believe in angels and demons, but he believes in aliens, right? Okay, fine. That's fine. So anyways, the podcast goes on with them for about an hour, maybe a little more. And then Wes's feed was cutting out. And during that, Billy Carson makes some quote about geniuses do genius stuff, or say, I don't even remember the quote. It was kind of ridiculous. And he gets up to leave. Wes comes back on. His screen comes back on, and he was like, hey, thank you, Billy. I really appreciate it. To show that Wes was really humble throughout the whole thing. And Wes mainly asked questions. So after this, Billy Carson's wife, I think, tells Mark's wife, hey, we don't want this put out right now. We have another debate lined up. Because Billy Carson's big claim is that no reputable Christian will debate him on these topics. so after this debate, which really wasn't a debate, it wasn't set up like a debate. There weren't moderators. There weren't opening statements. They weren't given equal time. It was a conversation in which Wes Huff offered some pushback. So this happens. Mark, out of his friendship for Billy Carson, agrees that I'm not going to put it out at this time. But he lets Wes know, and Wes is like, hey, just to let you know, can I get a copy? Can I get the file of the podcast? And I won't put it out, but I'm going to make a video saying that this happened. These are Wes's exact words, right? And okay, maybe not exact, but pretty exact. I'm confidently quoting Wes Huff because I've watched the interview. So then Billy Carson starts threatening to sue Mark, Anton, and Wes Huff. He also starts sending cease and desist letters, and he shows up to Mark's house at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning with the handwritten cease and desist letter. Mark attested to this in his own video and on the PBD podcast very recently. I also watched that. It was mainly between Patrick Bet-David and Wes Huff, but at the last 5 to 10 minutes, he brings on Mark so Mark can tell his side of the story, right? So, after this, Billy Carson puts out a 3-hour response video. Now, I've only seen clips from this. I haven't watched the whole thing. And I've seen this on multiple sources, right? I've seen multiple podcasts play clips of this, and Billy Carson's crashing out. But in this response video, aside from ranting about, he has all these air conditioners and he has a he's recording it from a movie theater in his house, he basically admits and says, I'm going to sue you. I don't care if you win. I just want you to spend money. It's called a slap lawsuit. Wes later on different podcasts explains it's going to be hard to sue me because I live in Canada and you're going to have to sue me in a Canadian court and they're going to have to find precedents. And basically, Billy Carson was hurting his own case by saying this stuff publicly. Any lawyer will tell you that if you're going to sue somebody, you don't talk about it till the case is over. Like you can only incriminate yourself or maybe not incriminate, but you could do things that damage your own lawsuit, right? Drink of water, Tom. So this blows up. Wes gets a whole he's at 200 plus thousand subs. So good for you, Wes Huff. This gets the attention of Joe Rogan. So sometime around the New Year or Christmas, between Christmas Eve and New Year's, Wes Huff posts a picture of him and Joe Rogan in Austin, Texas, and I'm pretty sure it's in Joe Rogan's studio. I've watched the Joe Rogan podcast. I haven't seen every episode. That's a lot of episodes. Watched a lot of clips. So I know some of the things that Joe Rogan in the past has said about Christianity. I've seen the clips where he thinks it was ridiculous and Constantine created it. And Joe Rogan, I think it's safe to say, did not have a very high opinion of religion. And my biggest wish has always been, and I've said this, I was like, man, I just want Joe Rogan to have a real Christian on. And by a real Christian, I mean someone that can defend some of the objections to Christianity or the Bible or the historicity of the text and the scriptures and the events. And let me tell you, Wes Huff was that guy. So before the episode comes out, people are making videos or getting on Twitter or online and they're like, oh, where's this episode? And then they start saying ridiculous things like Joe Rogan suppressing the tape and this, that, and the other, which I've never learned or never heard of Joe Rogan of doing. Joe Rogan records a video and he puts it out when he wants to. So I saw somewhere that Joe Rogan puts out videos between, I want to say, Tuesdays and Fridays. Because over the weekend, he's usually commentating UFC fights. That's what Joe Rogan also does. And Joe Rogan's married and has a family, and so he travels all over the world to do these UFC Ultimate Fighter competition, I think. Ultimate Fighting Champion or something. The UFC, like mixed martial arts, the biggest in the world. And so he's very busy doing that, doing his podcast, right? So I go, and I'm not going to lie, I'm typing as like, hey, is this Wes Huff interview ever going to come out? Not because I'm doubting Joe Rogan. I just want to see the podcast. I'm excited about it because I had already seen some Wes Huff stuff. So I'm like, man, now at this time I hadn't seen the entire Billy Carson Wes Huff interview. I had just seen clips because the Wes never. So Mark puts out the conversation between Wes and Billy out. He holds it for a month, and after a day, he takes it back down. And Wes Huff eventually puts it out, and people are accusing, like Billy Carson was accusing Wes Huff of deep faking and faking the fact that his, like, purposely cutting his camera out when he was getting exposed. Go watch the conversation for yourselves. Wes Huff is not getting exposed in this by any stretch of the imagination. So he goes on Joe Rogan. So okay, I want to say Tuesday, January 7th. In fact, I'm gonna look on my tablet at my calendar and make sure that the 7th was even on a Tuesday, because I don't. Hold on, I have a calendar here. There I do. Yeah, because today's the 14th. So it was January 7th. Because I had gone on the website a couple days before that, and it said it had listed some podcasts that had already come out on Spotify and on YouTube on the Joe Rogan podcast, the Joe Rogan Experience. Excuse me. I respect Joe Rogan, so I want to name these things correctly. So Joe, if you ever see this, which I doubt you will, but man, much love to you. Love your podcast. You talk to a lot of interesting people. So it's called the Joe Rogan Experience, and he's got a deal with Spotify. Anyways, so I see that it says January Wes Huff, but it doesn't have a date. I'm like, okay, well, and this is on Joe Rogan's website, or a website. It's like JoeRoganExperience.com or JRE.com or something. It's something that Google pulled up, and it's the list of his upcoming guests. So on Tuesday, January 7th, that link pops up again when I search, is this Wes Huff interview ever coming out? And I only put that because I feel like that would generate what people have been talking about and maybe get me an answer. Well, I got my answer, because on Tuesday, January 7th, I went to the website and it said Wes Huff, January 7th. And I was like, oh, snaps. So I immediately, because I can listen to stuff while I work, my boss does it too. I've seen her in her office. So my boss wasn't at work. She was on vacation, and I was in the office doing my little computer work for Walmart. And I put an earpiece in and I started playing the podcast. And Wes has already made a video rebutting himself, because he did misspeak a couple of times. Some of the examples of that is he quotes 1 Corinthians 15, and he says that Paul claims that Jesus appeared to over 400 people. It actually says that he appeared to over 500 people. So the truth is actually better. Like, Wes Huff just kind of downgraded a little bit, and I don't think he did it on purpose. I think he misspoke. He agrees to that. There was some issue with that the great Isaiah scroll, I want to say it's P1, but don't hold me on that. That of the Dead Sea Scrolls was word for word exactly like the Masoretic text. People came out with like, hey, there's a bunch of variants. But it's content-wise exactly like the Masoretic text. And Wes conceded that point and said, hey, I overstated the point. If Joe would have challenged me on that, I would have cleared it up a little more. But he's like, hey, look, like, I misspoke. He didn't lie. Okay, that's ridiculous. Because Wes Huff's admitting this on his own YouTube channel, right? Kudos to Wes. And if it sounds like I'm caping for Wes, it's because I am. This guy's getting his dissertation right now. He's been to seminary. He grew up as a missionary, and he studies these languages. Like, he has, like, so on the podcast, he gives a framed fragment that he made and copied himself on ancient papyrus to Joe Rogan. And Joe Rogan was blown away and appreciative. And listen, Wes Huff, the podcast was 3 hours long, right? And Wes Huff did a great job. He even asked Joe Rogan, "What do you think about Jesus after all this?" And Joe Rogan gives a very honest answer, and he answered it with his questioning process of like, "Oh, like this guy," and it's so funny that Joe Rogan actually kind of quotes the gospel. He's like, "Well, there's this guy who obviously lived, who obviously died," because Wes goes on and he's like, "Look, there are three things that in historical, because Wes is a historian also, and scholarship that are accepted." That Jesus actually lived, that he was crucified by the Romans under Pontius Pilate, and that his people, and Wes claimed people close to his inner circle. And I would disagree with that a tad bit and say, no, I think it's his actual inner circle. So, John the Apostle, Peter, James, the half-brother of Jesus. So, Jesus was born of a virgin. So, Mary and Joseph had other children. Not miraculously, right? Though I guess you could say that every birth is a miracle because people have sex or intercourse and then we don't at all decide if that turns into a baby. That's God's doing, right? So, that people after the fact of Jesus' death and burial claimed to have seen the risen Jesus, touched him, ate with him, and that he taught them for 40 days. That is the claim. Now, people dispute that may not believe it or not, but those three things are some of the most historically attested events in the ancient world. He goes over the manuscript evidence and all that. And I'm not like, listen, and so now the Wes Huff Joe Rogan interview, last time I checked, was at, I'll just look it up. It was at 4-point-something million, and I think I looked at it today. Just because I was doing a lot of thinking the last 2 days about this podcast, and I really want to be clear and not misspeak, and I want to have my facts straight. Oh, sorry. YouTube started playing on, so do not take my video down. First things first, your video popped up on a short. So, I don't know why I keep typing in Joe Rogan podcast when it's a Joe Rogan experience, but it still gets you there. Okay, my tablet is messing up because oh my gosh. I'm just going to have to type it in because I keep clicking on something and it's going to something completely different. Okay, yes. So, as of right now, the Joe Rogan, hold on, where is it? Oh, there it is. Everybody seems to like to wear black on Joe Rogan, just saying. And it might be because there's the red background, it looks good. And Wes is buff, man. People have been calling him Wes Buff. 4.4 million views in a week. I want to say that's top 10 in the past 6 months. And people that are beating him are Donald Trump, has got like 54 million views. Elon Musk, J.D. Vance. So the incoming president, the incoming vice president, an incoming member of the cabinet who runs SpaceX and Twitter and Tesla, Theo Vaughn, who's a very funny guy. Mel Gibson was on there, and Mark Zuckerberg, who started Facebook. So, and there's some others, right? That Russell Crowe, great in Gladiator, great in Noah, but the movie was terrible. But Russell Crowe just did his job. So I do not beseech, or I do not begrudge Russell Crowe's performance because he's an actor. The movie is trash. If you're a Christian, man, just I don't even want to promote it, but go watch it. It's garbage. Sorry, guys, I need a drink of water. Water time. That's going to be a thing. Whenever I need to get a drink of water, we're just going to say water time. That way, if you want to fast forward, you can fast forward. So, the aftermath. So, Wes Huff goes on Joe Rogan. I've been thinking about this for 2 days. What would I grade the podcast? And I would say anywhere from a 9 out of 10 to an 11 out of 10. And I know that's not possible, but whatever. It's my podcast. I don't care. Because I just think that Wes is so humble and he's funny and he had a conversation with a guy who's not a believer. But Joe Rogan is just very curious. I think they said Joe Rogan said wow 30 something times, maybe 40. And Joe Rogan is searching for something, I think. I don't want to speak for Joe because I've never met him, don't know him, obviously. Because if I did, I probably wouldn't be doing a podcast on my cell phone. But Joe Rogan he's just always been a very interesting person to me. And he's always been very interested in learning new stuff. And Joe Rogan, he basically presented the gospel. He basically said, not saying that he's a Christian or believes it, but he says, well, we got to think about it because there's this guy who obviously lived, who died, and people claim that he resurrected, but then you have to believe that he's a son of God and you have to commit yourself to an idea and submit to it. And I'm like, man, he's giving the gospel. And then he says some other things like, hey, but there's like ignorant people and oral traditions. Because like he asks Wes before that, what do you think of this event? Do you think it's a historical event? And Wes, to his credit, answers that. He's like, well, the historicity of the event. And that's when I think he brings up Paul's claim. And actually, I'm going to read that. I'm going to read 1 Corinthians 15. So I'm going to pull it up on my tablet. First off, I'm going to read 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 13 through, let's do 18. So I can't be accused of pulling this out of context. Now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison. Yes, I read a verse over. And so that's where we get apologetics from. Apologia, to give it a defense for, but we must do it with humbleness and gentleness and respect, so that when people talk bad about us, that, what does it say? So that those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. So Billy's been saying and accusing Wes of all this stuff, and it's like, bro, like, we saw the interview and we've seen Wes's other videos, and we know that this guy is respectful, and he was respectful at the end, and you're the one that walked out of the video. Billy Carson, my guy, and you're not really my guy, but I just want to be, I want to be fair and I want to be respectful. You've made these claims, and Wes said it best. If Billy Carson had just walked out and then never talked about this would not have blown up. Wes has said it himself. Wes had like 2,000 to 4,000 subscribers before this. People didn't know who Wes Huff was. I've only known who Wes Huff is, and I want to say the last 4 or 5 months, and it's just an accident because YouTube be putting me on some fire apologists. I just find you guys on YouTube, I subscribe, and I watch a lot of your videos. And so I've recommended before Mike Winger. So there's a channel called Inspiring Philosophy. I don't agree with IP on everything, but I enjoy his content. And IP had Mike Winger on and Wes Huff to discuss this. And this is before the Joe Rogan experience. And it's so funny because they were like, man, we need to try to get Wes Huff on Joe Rogan. And no one, and then it happened. Like, now I don't think that those guys would never say they made it happen, but it's just funny. And Wes has said all along this is a God thing, right? So let's go to 1 Corinthians 15. I was about to say my tablet's being a jerk tonight, but it's just me not working it right. So 1 Corinthians 15. All right. So 1 Corinthians chapter 15, we're not going to read the whole chapter, but we're going to read, I think, through verse 11. Now, this is all from the English Standard Version, by the way. So if you're King James only, sorry, not sorry. Sorry, not sorry. Now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, who's Peter, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. Last of all, to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than all of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preach, and you so believed. Most people believe that's that Paul is actually quoting what we would call a creed. One of the first early statements of faith in the early church. We believe that 1 Corinthians was written in the 50s, maybe early 60s. So this creed could go back. This creed had to be before 54 to 60 AD. Do not quote me on the date, but I know I'm right in around that time. So this could have been within a decade after Jesus's death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. So Paul is claiming, and when he says sleep there, that means death, right? So Jesus appeared to more than 500 people, most of whom still are alive, though some have fallen asleep. So he's saying, go ask those people. So when people read this, when it was written, they could have gone and asked these eyewitnesses. That's why the only claim that the Jews actually make is that the disciples stole the body. But it's like at some point, so if you crucified a guy remember, the Jews and the Romans had two different reasons for crucifying Jesus. So the Jews accused him of blasphemy, but they also knew that the Romans didn't care about that. So they would say, I think they said to Pilate, this man claims to be king. We have no king but Caesar. And so the Romans would have executed him for sedition. Now, whether the Romans crucified him for that reason is whatever, right? So this is all very interesting. I wanted to cover it. Thank you, Wes Huff, for just the amazing job you did on Joe Rogan, the amazing job you did on Patrick Bet-David. I want to say you went on Ruslan KD YouTube channel. So Ruslan, a Christian rapper, podcaster, Bless God Studios, right? I also wanted to say James White, Dr. James White, a Calvinist. I don't agree with Calvinism most of the time, but he is phenomenal, and he is a scholar himself, and he's Alpha and Omega Ministries. James White had a very good take on the Wes Huff Joe Rogan interview, and he was fair, and he commended Wes, and not that I was surprised, but James White is an intellectual's intellectual, so he could have been criticized Wes on some points. Once again, there's a train. So I told you in the last podcast, you will hear trains in these videos. Until I ever have enough money and following to have a studio, we're going to do this in the apartment. So Wes Huff did a great job. James White acknowledged this. Justin Peters Ministries, who calls out every false teacher under the planet, and he's mostly right. I think he's always right. I think it becomes too much of his channel, but I'm not going to tell a man how to do that. He covered this, pointed out some of Wes's missteps by misspeaking, and was also very gracious. There's a bunch of other videos that I did not watch because and maybe the titles were clickbaity, but it seemed to be people calling out Wes for not giving the gospel and not challenging Joe. And I just was like, you know what? I'm not going to watch those at this time. I'm not saying I'll never watch them, but I've heard other people comment on the criticisms, people who I trust online. So people like Ruslan and Mike Winger, and it's like, and James White, who have been faithful with their content online. So I trust them in most things. Like, listen, there's a lot of guys who are Calvinists, and I'm not a Calvinist, but like when they talk about historical Christianity, when they talk about, these are real Christians and they're wise men, and I view them as my online elders, right? I view them as my online mentors. I don't know these people, but I've read their books, and not all of them, but I've read a lot of their books. So like I trust them to be faithful in their commentary. A bunch of these rebuttals coming from YouTube channels I've never heard of, which doesn't mean anything because they've never heard of mine. But there were also Christians criticizing Joe Rogan before the podcast came out. And I'm like, guys, we're supposed to be gracious and humble and reaching the lost and presenting a defense of Christianity with grace. And you're going after Joe Rogan online? First off, Joe Rogan's probably not going to see the comment. Second off, the podcast came out. So a lot of these claims were ridiculous. And it's bro, like, my biggest issue with Christian YouTube is so much of the bickering and arguing in the comments. And listen, we call out false teaching, like obvious false teachers like Jesse Duplantis and the I'm trying to remember what it's called, the prosperity gospel, the name it claim it gospel. I see a lot of that, and we got to call out the truth. But I don't need, if a person is misguided, I don't call out the person, I call out the teaching. If a person knows better and they're in a position of authority and I believe them to be a false prophet, then you call out the false prophet. But not everyone is a wolf. Not everyone is out here to jump out behind the bushes and be like, I'm trying to trick you. Some people just have bad theology, and we should always call that out. If I said something that was not central to the essentials of Christianity, then I would like someone to call me out to. I had a guy call me out on the Trinity, and I stopped engaging with said fellow because he kept saying logical people this and logical people that, and people who were trained. Like, bro, do you think all Christians aren't logical? Like, your channel is talking about the new God, right? And I'm not criticizing you. You said you wrote a book. I'm probably not going to read it because there's just a lot of new age stuff going on where like God's in everything, and it's, you deny the Trinity, you deny the historical Jesus. I'm not saying you do this, guy who commented on my YouTube. I'm saying this is what the new age does, right? And I realized that, number one, I have a real job. Not saying you don't, but I have a job that pays me that is not this YouTube channel, not my TikTok page, not my Instagram, not Facebook, not Spotify, right? No one pays me. But I do have a job that I go to 5 days a week, 5 days a week, 40 hours a week. And that's my job. So I don't have time. I mean, when I see that the conversation is not leading anywhere, then man, agree to disagree. You think the Trinity is 1 + 1 + 1 and it's illogical, like, and then I made a claim that, because he was like, millions of people or people for centuries haven't believed this, but people for centuries have. And then I was like, and I said millions, which is of course way more people believe in the Godhead, the Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, all being one in being in three persons, right? I'm not going to go over that again. Either you believe it or you don't. And I don't have to defend it. You can find other Christian people. But to say that people trained in logic and reasoning don't believe this, or because I know what it is. It sounds like a contradiction. But just because you don't understand the nature of God, and I don't fully understand it, doesn't, because who created logic? If God, the eternal, uncaused first cause, right, of the universe, created the universe out of nothing and he is an eternal being, then he created logic, right? For finite beings and a finite universe, right? Because you know what else is not logical in basic logic is something coming from nothing. But that's what even the Big Bang says that. The Big Bang says that there was a singular point that exploded in a split of a second billions of years ago. I don't know how long ago it was, right? And that everything that we have now came out of that. But what's the cause, right? So Christianity is saying that cause is God. So who created God? Well, if you keep going back in time, there has to be a first uncaused something, right? That caused all this to be, because if infinity existed, we would never get to today. So, if the universe has a cause, which I think it does, then if you keep going back, and it's because people say like a multiverse, right? But then it's like that universe, let's say that this universe was created by another universe in the past, but then that universe would have, so now we're still stuck on a line that has two arrows on the end. There's no dot that specifies that. So I didn't appreciate the audacity of, and maybe this wasn't your intent, person who commented on my channel, and you were the only person that commented, so I can't be talking to anybody else. Videos got 22 views. Hey, your videos have more views than mine. Congratulations. Like, no, and I really do mean that. And I might check out your stuff. I really might. I already can tell by what it's. I read the intro to your channel, and I wish you nothing but the best. But I'm not going to engage with you on every video, because it didn't seem like. It seemed like you're setting your position and I'm setting mine, which is fine. There is a quote in a YouTube video by Vodi Bakum. Vodi Bakum is I don't know what to call him. I think right now he's the president of University of Zambia. Dr. Vodi Bakum, if you see this and that's the wrong place, please accept my apology. I saw Vodi Bakum speak years ago at a youth conference when I was a youth, and I'm 40. I've read parts of a Vodi Bakum book. I need to finish Expository Apologetics. Really good book. Once again, don't agree with Vodi and everything, but I really respect Vodi, and I think he's dead right in a lot of things. Oh, that's the wrong quote. So he does this talk about why he chooses to believe the Bible. And he says, I choose to believe the Bible because it is a reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses. They report supernatural events that took place in fulfillment of specific prophecies, and they claim that their writings are divine rather than human in origin. Right? So, and that's not the gospel. That's just why he chooses to believe, or what does he say? He's like, he chooses to believe the Bible, right? Now, what's in the Bible is more than that. It's not outside of that, but that's the methodology. I think that's the right word. Methodology is the word. No, that's right. Methodology, not mythology. Methodology. I don't know what that is, but so yeah. On this channel, we're going to talk about objective truth. We're going to talk about objective morality. We're going to talk about universalism, which I do not hold to, by the way. We're going to talk about why all religions can't be the same. We're going to talk about the deity of Jesus. Did Jesus claim to be God? There's already a video up on that. It's called Part 1. I don't remember because I basically did Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I think at the end of the video, I was like, I'm just going to do John by itself, and then I never did it. So I might do the John portion of where Jesus claims to be divine. We're going to talk about how you have to read the Bible in its proper context. The Bible was written not to us, but for us. It was written to a specific audience. Like there's letters to the church at Corinth. That's who that's to. But it's still for us. So Like when people say Jesus never said he was God, I'm like, no. In the Bible, you will not find a verse where Jesus walks up to the woman at the well and be like, I am God. But if you know the context and the Son of Man title, and if you know when Jesus says he's coming on the clouds, sitting at the right hand of power, when Jesus claims to forgive sins, right? I have a whole video on that. He's making a claim that he is God. He's the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity. I'm not afraid to say it. Comment again. I probably won't respond just because, dude, we agree to disagree. And you can think I'm illogical. You should go read William Lane Craig. That a Christian philosopher, way smarter than me, because I'm not the smartest guy on the internet by any means of anywhere. Like Wes Huff is way smarter than me. But I want the people that follow me to understand why I believe what I believe. Why do I claim that the Bible that I read is true? Why is it an inspired word of God? No, we do not. Okay, there's people who actually believe this. Probably some of the King James only people. But do I believe that this right here, the ESV, is exactly word for word, letter for letter, an exact copy of every word in the original manuscripts? No. What I mean by that is I believe there are textual variants, and we have 3,000 to 5,000 copies of, I think, just the New Testament manuscripts, right? Now, do I believe that any textual variant, or has it been proved, changes a single essential doctrine in this Bible in Christianity? No. So you're not going to find a manuscript of the actual Bible from any of the 66 canonical books of the Bible that denies the resurrection, denies the virgin birth of Jesus, denies the creation, that denies historical events that happened, that is going to deny the Trinity, deny that Jesus is coming back, deny the crucifixion, the burial, the resurrection, that Jesus actually existed. It's in there. It's in the copies of the original, which we don't have because they were written in places on papyrus, but people copied them early. The church fathers also quoted scripture, so much so that some people believe we could have 95% of the New Testament if you burned every Bible alive. We have these copies, these manuscripts. You can read them. You can compare them. Now you would probably have to learn Hebrew, and me included, Hebrew and Greek. So I watch a lot of videos on people that I trust, even people who have differing opinions. So it's like, okay, the majority of people who understand Hebrew says this means that. So you're going to have disagreements like the word yom. Was the Genesis account 6 literal days? There's a lot of views on that. I think as long as you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, God in human flesh, died for your sins, lived the life you could, and died the death you should have, bodily died, was buried, and bodily resurrected. He's coming back. This shirt right here, I'll move the mic. Jesus, I am the way, the truth, the life. Actually, it just says the way, the truth, and the life. John 14:6. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. I believe that. I know that there's ramifications for that for people who would be offended by that, but I would just like to please remind you that I did not write it. So you can come for me. I'm just going to tell you. I'm going to tell you that in person. I didn't write it. I believe it. Because they can't all be the same. Because if they're all the same, then the difference is, like, listen, if a text says that Jesus was neither crucified, or it says God has no son, that Jesus was neither crucified, Jesus neither died nor was crucified, or that he was crucified on a stake, and another text says that Jesus is the Son of God and that he died for our sins, he was crucified on a cross, and he resurrected, those statements contradict each other, right? So a lot of this podcast, I'm going to get off here because I'm getting sleepy. You probably see it in my eyes. Man, it's been a long day. I've been up since 6 a.m. I don't even know what time it is. What time is it? 9:03. So thank you guys if you watch this podcast. Please, if you watch this podcast, please subscribe and like. I only have 7 subscribers, which is fine. 7's the number of perfection in Scripture, so that's cool. But I would like to get to enough subscribers where I can do this live. But it is what it is. And I know some people don't be on YouTube like that, which is cool. I was gonna wear this hat during the podcast, but I have a lot of hats and shoes because I don't know. I think the hat looks cool and it matches the shirt. But I decided not to because I'm really happy with this fade that I got at the barbershop. And see, kind of like poof the hair up, makes it look cool. But anyways, the way I'm sitting is killing my back. So this is Christ in a Culture War. I am Jesse James Williams, your host. Thank you for everything. Y'all have a blessed night. So I'm going to get off here and upload this to YouTube. So be blessed.